Good afternoon to all the participants connected, and good afternoon to the speakers that are here with me. First of all, Heather Grabbe, Director of the Open Society European Policy Institute in Brussels. Welcome, Heather. Ferruccio Pastore, Director of the Forum on International European Research on Immigration Theory. Welcome, Ferruccio. Thomas Christiansen, Professor in the Political Science Department at Lewis University in Rome. Welcome, Thomas. And connected online, we have Anna Osipchuk, who is Associate Professor in Sociology and Director for Research at the School for Policy Analysis at National University of Kiev. Welcome, Anna. Good. So, as I said, I welcome the participants online. You will be able to interact with the speakers in the second part of the seminar. You can write your questions and comments in the chat. I will collect a few of them, as many as possible, and then ask to the speakers to react. So, as you know, we're living dramatic hours as the conflict in Ukraine escalates, and all the attempt to reach an agreement at the diplomatic level repeatedly failed. At the same time, the European Union has reacted with a number of measures, with all the means at its disposal, I would say. Diplomacy, unprecedented sanctions. The European Union has also offered the military support through the procurement of lethal arms to the Ukrainian government for the first time in its history, and has agreed on an emergency mechanism to offer facilitated access and protection of the protection of rights to the refugees arriving from Ukraine to the EU. That's why European leaders in the past couple of weeks have talked about a watershed moment for the European Union and defined the European Union as a true geopolitical actor. But beyond rhetoric, we would like to start with a first round with our speakers. I would like to know, in your opinion, how is this Russian invasion of Ukraine reshaping the European order, and what would be the EU's role in the world in the next future? So I will ask you to react to this first question for 5 minutes each, and then we will go deeper into the discussion. Heather, would you like to start?
Well, thanks very much. It's great to be here at EI, and thank you to Nicoletta for organizing this. We're taking a rather holistic and medium-term view of the crisis amid all of the short-term emergencies and issues to follow. It's really important to keep some perspective and to think about what all of this means, not only for the EU's role as an actor, but also for the future of the continent, because this is going to reshape the continent in so many different ways. So security, solidarity, and climate, in my view, are very much linked. The EU needs to push forward on all three. It's very welcome that yesterday the Commission came out with far-reaching proposals for an energy independence plan, which will now go to the summit of heads of state and government, the European Council in Versailles tomorrow. And it's really vital that they, in thinking about the short-term need to create greater independence of European energy from Russia, and also to, frankly, cut Russia out of a major source of revenue for Putin and his regime, that they're also thinking about the longer term, both what kinds of transition we need in order still to achieve climate goals, because climate change is not stopped by this war, quite the opposite. Higher energy prices don't necessarily mean lower consumption. And also because this is so important for Putin's calculations about the war itself. And plus, it's the best hope for Ukraine. Really, a move towards a low carbon economy would would be the best way of ensuring Ukraine's own long-term security, both military, territorial integrity, as well as energy security. And I think we should go into that a bit later. But just to think about the immediate impact, this is a very 20th century war. We're seeing again tanks and bombs and even the nuclear threat. Just recently, Emmanuel Macron called NATO brain dead, and there were quite a few defense reviews in various countries talking about we don't really need tanks anymore. But that's exactly the way that the invasion has taken place. It's a bit of a back to the future moment in terms of the Cold War and indeed the Second World War. But there were also very 21st century motivations behind it. The climate transition very much threatens Vladimir Putin's hold on power, both climate change itself and the structure of his regime. And it's very important to bear that in mind when looking at the issues of energy security in the short term as well as the long term. Russian oil alone, never mind gas, puts $285 million per day in Putin's pocket. And particularly the way that oil and gas, fossil fuel resources, create centralized energy revenues that allow one man to run a regime with a circle of loyal oligarchs. That wouldn't be possible in a low carbon economy with much more distribution, much more even distribution of energy sources and in even distribution of energy revenues. So the structure of fossil fuel, the fossil fuel markets and the fossil fuel industry is related also to keeping autocrats in power. Now, that has meant that the main resources of the state have been in his hands and have given him enormous leverage over his neighbors. And the European Union ignored the red light on this issue in 2014. After the Russian aggression in Crimea and, of course, Donetsk and Luhansk, imports of Russian gas and coal to by the European Union actually went up. And, of course, after a brief pause, work continued on the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline to try to bypass Ukraine. That's the aim of that pipeline. And if you think about it, this is the moment of maximum leverage for Vladimir Putin. His leverage is only going to decrease over the medium and the long term because of climate action. The European Green Deal is a direct threat to his hold on power. There's the impact of climate change on Russia itself with the melting permafrost, which undermines literally the infrastructure for the fossil fuel industry. And that's contributing also to the slow development of a climate consciousness in Russia, which also threatens the centralized and fossil fuel dependent regime. And of course, there's CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and other policy measures looming from the EU that will have a big impact on the dependency of the EU on Russian gas, which of course has now been massively speeded up. So the threat to the whole system on which he relies, that the European Green Deal represents, and also the potential for extending it to Ukraine, which I hope we can come back to later in the discussion, are clearly factors that were very important in thinking about this. But it's also important to think about Putin's goal of the de-Westernization of Russia, the way in which war and the sanctions that we have, I think, rightfully imposed, they do actually contribute to that project. So if we think about Putin as trying to reshape the European security order and go back on everything that happened after 1991, the energy dependence and the way in which the climate transition will affect the structure of power in Russia itself, reduces leverage, as well as the relationship between the EU and Russia, and indeed the EU and its neighbors, are really critical to bear in mind. You can no longer divorce climate, energy, security, and solidarity.
Thank you, Heather, for your first comments. Very interesting. Ferruccio, what do you think will be the new European Union after this crisis?
Yes, thank you. First, Nicoletta and Yai for organizing this and for inviting me. I think we are all shocked and surprised by what we see happening in Ukraine and around the brutality of invasion, the strength and the bravery of the reaction, the magnitude and the speed of the refugee outflow. But I think we should also be equally surprised by some things that we do not see happening and that could have happened, or maybe we expected to happen. In spite of the very uneven impact of the war on EU member states in terms of trade, energy, and refugee outflows, there was not serious division so far. But we could have expected this to happen. When speaking of refugee flows and reactions to it, 2015-16 saw the European Union on the brink of an existential crisis, as it was called, due to uneven distribution of what was perceived as a burden. In the Mediterranean, until today, we see no solidarity, no real solidarity on a key sovereign activity as search and rescue of people in distress. And the 2001 directive on temporary protection, as we know very well today, was there, but was never activated, even though there were several occasions in which it could have been activated. Probably the Russian leadership expected and hoped for a division to take place. There was the very recent precedent of the strategically engineered arrivals from Belarus last year. And it was, common wisdom in the European Union that there was an external mastermind behind Lukashenko's choices and moves. So this hasn't happened so far. The division hasn't materialized so far. We can, of course, be happy about it, rejoice about it, also because it would have been otherwise very different to take common stance, for instance, on sanctions with bitter, deep divisions on this other side of a crisis, that is the human and migration dimension. But I think it's also important to ask ourselves why this division hasn't happened so far, also in order to learn from this tragic episode, which is, of course, not over. First, of course, there are legal reasons. We are doing what we, in principle, are bound to do. There is a visa-free regime with Ukraine since 5 years. There is a non-refoulement principle, in principle, binding us all. So any other reaction than opening borders to refugees would have been illegal, in fact, but this doesn't prevent pushbacks and rejections at external European borders to happen almost every day, from Greece to the Libyan, to the Sicily Channel, to the Croatian borders, to Poland also, as it happened a few months ago with Kurdish refugees and others coming from Belarus. Of course, there are also strategic considerations that, of course, have backed this unity of Europeans so far on refugee admission. A rejection of Ukrainians would have been a massive gift to Putin and a massive blow on Ukraine, and probably political suicide for the European Union. But there are also less pleasant, less rational explanations for this unity on refugee admission, because it is clear that not all refugees are equal in the perception of several leaderships in the European Union. And it is blatant that solidarity is not always colorblind. Some leaders and some public political representatives had made it very clear in describing these refugees as different, as educated, as similar to us. So the big question is how long this will this unity on the refugee dimension of the crisis hold. It obviously depends on the developments on the ground. The potential for forced migration is definitely still large. There are millions who are threatened but are trapped, cannot get out of their cities and houses often for the moment. The outflow that was, let's remember it, unprecedented, 2 million in 2 weeks, is something that hasn't happened since the Second World War. What is very demographically unbalanced. It's mainly composed by women and children, adolescents, and some elderly people, which is also a unique and unprecedented feature in large-scale force movements in the last years. And at some point, if the situation doesn't stabilize in short term in Ukraine, this wave will be followed by family regroupment. By the way, beneficiaries of the European temporary protection are entitled to family reunion. So the potential is still large, and this will definitely put much more stress on the unity of European Union member states on this. Yes, I'm stopping this for this round. Thank you.
Thanks. We will come back to this, Ferruccio. Thomas, your take about the European Union in the face of this crisis.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nicoletta, for the invitation, for organizing this event. Welcome, everyone, and solidarity with Anna and her compatriots in this terrible time. It's an honor to speak here in this round. 5 minutes is little time to address these huge issues. I would maybe like to make 5 initial points if I can, but do interrupt me if I speak too long. So first of all, I mean, also to echo what was said already, I would not only take a medium-term view, but rather a long-term view of the things, because indeed it's a fundamental reconfiguration of what happens in Europe. It's a new era, and we have mentally, I think, not managed to catch up with all the things that implies. But I think we need to prepare ourselves for fundamental changes and for the long haul. This war, however it may proceed, I think will not be short. Even if, I mean, first of all, it's inconceivable right now to see some sort of end game that Putin may have. Nothing short of instability in Russia itself could possibly lead to a Russian change of policy. And I think that means, apart from what it means, obviously, for the people of Ukraine, I think it also means long-lasting instability on the continent, and something that I think will be an era of instability that one will have to live with. Secondly, I think clearly the EU has become central in a way that it hasn't been before. I mean, there have been many crises, and there have been many observers, including myself, who've pointed out that however many crises we've had in the last couple of decades, the EU has sometimes counterintuitively come out of these crises strengthened, with stronger institutions, with new policies, with a greater resolve. So there's a bit of a disconnect between the public debate about Europe on the one hand and the actual developments on the ground. Not that the EU has done everything right, and obviously problems remain. But I think in this crisis also the EU has stepped up surprisingly quickly, and actually one can see already a strengthening of the institutional structures and the policies of the EU. Obviously, this is a crisis of such proportions that no member state could conceive of addressing them alone. It's incidentally rather curious to see how Britain is now fooling around a bit between NATO and the EU, and is left on its own to some extent, not being inside the EU. So I think clearly the EU has become more central to the existing member states, and it has also become even more attractive to non-member state, which is my next point. The third one, which is how we relate now to Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, also the former Yugoslavia, the Western Balkans. Clearly, there is a greater attraction now to join the EU. But I think one has to recognize the difficulties in envisaging full membership. In fact, what one really has to think more systematically about is other things than full membership. We already have a growing literature and practice of differentiated integration inside the EU. That may increase when defense becomes more relevant. Perhaps that becomes a new divide between neutral and non-neutral states, as it were. But it may also well be that the existing member states are being pushed more together by this external threat in terms of greater unity internally. But what clearly will be needed to also address issues such as Turkey is a way of managing relationships with the neighborhood that finds a better compromise between membership and non-membership, as it were. The neighborhood policy as it is obviously a bit in tatters, but at the same time, strong relationships will be needed in order to manage this relationship. So we maybe have time to come back to that later, but just to say that there's some sort of reconfiguration of how the EU relates to non-member states will be needed. Because clearly membership for a country like Georgia is not on the cards, and not even perhaps for Serbia and the like. My fourth point is on the economic impact. This is clearly very significant. I mean, we're looking at a really long haul of a recession, partly due to instability, partly due to sanctions. Their immediate impact themselves may not be that significant, but clearly the corollaries are the massive increase in energy prices, which will then have to be perhaps subsidized in some way through the public purse. The massive increase that we will also see in food prices and inflation more generally. So we're actually looking at a perfect storm where we have a massive recession, significant inflation, and further increases in public debt on top of everything that we've seen already. There's now already talk about the second new recovery fund, the usual battle lines already drawn between the frugals and others. But we're looking at a very, very difficult period economically for Europe in the next decade. And fifth, geopolitics, that was already mentioned. Clearly, here also lines are being redrawn in the global picture. I mean, of course, this pushes Europe and North America back together, as it were. Let's see what happens with the 2024 election. But for the moment, transatlantic ties are clearly strengthened by this. The real question is what happens on the other side of the equation, namely between China and Russia. A lot of assumptions were, and maybe are, that this also pushes Russia and China together, that this Cold War that the United States had with China will now become a global war. Perhaps a little ironic that there were voices in Europe that were advocating getting closer to Russia to balance Chinese power. If anything, now the opposite is clearly true. We need perhaps to get closer to China to balance Russian power. I read a piece yesterday by Sven Biskov, which I found very instructive, that we shouldn't assume that China is necessarily on Russia's side, that in fact, the sort of prevarication and hedging that the Chinese are now doing in this, clearly they are more on the Russian side, let's say, than on the Western side, but they are also clearly not wanting to go too far in that, is actually an interesting sign that we can avoid, as it were, a global Cold War of that nature, that China perhaps can be some sort of balancing factor or mediator in some way, and that we may find that we are still not in a bipolar world where we have two clearly defined camps, but that we are still in a multipolar world where there are different camps, and the chances are still that Russia can be somewhat isolated. I leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. I would like now to give the chance to Anna to jump in our discussion based on what you heard by our speakers. Yeah. Seen from Kiev. Hi, Anna. Seen from Kiev, how do you judge the European response to this crisis, and what kind of actor do you think the European Union will become in the next future?
I actually, the first thing I want to say that I think everyone, and I mean also everyone in Kiev, in establishment and in think tanks and within academia, were very much actually surprised by the strength and the unity of European response. I think that if because before there was very much debates about whether Europe is becoming a weaker actor than, let's say, US or NATO. And there is actually a joke, I think, which is not really a joke, but it clearly reflects the reality here. But this is a joke that we kind of have memos made about that European Union appeared to be stronger than NATO, that everyone hoped for NATO, but NATO is actually lagging behind in response. Though we do get a lot of support from particular countries, and that is US, Britain, for example, but actually probably one of the strongest supporters is the European Union as a united force, and even from countries that were for years, taking a separate stance regarding Ukraine, for example, Hungary and some other countries that, were often called Putin Versteiners here. We do get this unity in response, and that also means the Germans' position, for example, on a lot of questions, and including lethal weapons for Ukraine. So I guess that was probably the biggest surprise, and I also agree with speakers. I think Heather mentioned that that it was very much a miscalculation also, because certainly I think that Russia and Putin were not counting on this unity, that it indeed came as a surprise here. It's very interesting why it is that way, because I think one of the reasons is also probably the what was actually occurred here in Ukraine, because no one gave us more than 3 days of fighting in all military analysis, but also I think that this can't explain everything about this reaction. So I guess that it's actually came to the inner, let's say, European Union. It sounds pathetic, but values and stance and positions. So, and I guess the fact that Europe, I think, is also threatened by it become clearly that Europe is threatened by Russia here. I wanted to address several points. I think that was mentioned. I think that indeed the energy independence and the development of other energy resources than fossil resources are probably within the most important, like in a mid-term perspective and long-term perspective. And I also think that and probably even in a short-term perspective too, because we clearly see it in Ukraine here that a lot of actually of our energy resources here are under direct threat. So because it become obvious that energy plants, including nuclear plants, are among the objects that are first under attack. So it shows that it's very much energy is probably on the forefront here, and also another problem that I think becomes obvious, even if the let's say the military action won't last too long. But the problem with the agriculture sector and with food prices that I think Thomas mentioned, it's also very, very important, because obviously what is happening now is that the season, the part of the planting season won't be held here in Ukraine, and Ukraine is a large exporter of a lot of food produce, so, and especially grains, so and corn. So it is a very much a factor. And I also read several analysis of how actually this factor can influence China's stance on in this conflict, and whether China will be, like, let's say, a power in itself, not really joining anyone in this conflict, but trying to balance, as well as I think in other actors, for example, the position of India here, which is not really that much of a force at China, but it's still an important actor in all of this. So I guess, coming back again to your question, I do think that we very much were positively surprised by the strength of European Union response and the unity of it. And I know that the question whether there could be a joint foreign policy in EU were very much debated before, but these events actually shown that there is a place for a strong joint policy.
Thank you so much, Anna, for your intervention. We'll get back to you. And I want to now go deeper with the speakers on the different aspects we touch upon in this first round. And in the meantime, I want to encourage the participants online to send our questions. Some of you have already done so, but this is the moment if you want to address any specific question to the speaker. So Heather, Anna was saying that the energy question is of course central. There is now an attempt by the European Union to reduce energy dependence, as you mentioned before, and a number of measures have been taken which risk on the other side to jeopardize the commitments of the European Union in the framework of the Green Deal and the climate objectives for the next future. So in your opinion, how does it look like, and how this will affect the relationship between the European Union and the neighborhood? And just one other point, a question that we received online already. Instead of going back to unsustainable energy resources such as coal, for example, is not the right time to rethink and rediscuss the nuclear energy option as a possible way forward. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thanks so much to Anna for joining us from Kiev. It's amazing to hear you speaking directly from there, and really fantastic that you're still so actively and vigorously taking part in debates. We really salute you. So as Anna was just saying, energy independence is really important for Ukraine itself. Ukraine, of course, relies a great deal for public revenues on transit of gas, in particular across its territory, about $3 billion a year. And 40% of Russian gas transits across Ukraine to reach its eventual consumers. So this is hugely important. And it's evident, as Anna was just saying, that the targeting of nuclear plants is a tactical objective of the Russian forces, while maintaining the gas infrastructure for Russia to continue earning revenues. So this is sort of paradoxical approach, which means that it's enormously important as a strategic objective of all those who support Ukraine, particularly in Europe, to assist in immediate measures to help Ukraine to reduce its own dependence on Russian energy, delivery and indeed on the transit fees, as well as for the longer term future to deepen a great deal the relationship with the European Union. And I'll just highlight two aspects of that. One is, of course, the application that Volodymyr Zelensky put in for EU membership 5 days after the invasion began, and which was followed up on Friday by Georgia and Moldova also submitting their applications for EU membership, and what that might mean and whether it's useful. Now, the EU heads of state and government are gathering in Versailles tomorrow and Friday, and I would really encourage them to meet this historical moment with a new kind of Versailles Declaration. The historical resonance should be to learn the lessons of the last Versailles Declaration and issue one which contributes to long-lasting peace in Europe through integration, by offering Ukraine a very clear European perspective. Now, I worked on enlargement myself in academia and in policy for a very long time, and I know that accession takes a long time necessarily. It's not possible to leapfrog the stages in the accession process because EU membership entails doing things that Ukraine would not serve Ukraine right now in its hour of need. Every effort in Ukraine, understandably, needs to be devoted to defending the country, defending the territorial integrity of the country. So it's not the moment for the Rada to start debating how to implement 100,000 pages of EU legislation and meet all of the single market standards and the other obligations of membership. But Ukraine clearly needs a very strong signal of solidarity, and especially a strong message that Europe will not abandon its neighbors when they are attacked. And that even if Russia succeeds in taking more Ukrainian territory, Ukrainians are very much part of the European family and will be firmly integrated into Europe in every possible way, no matter what happens. That needs to be an unconditional welcome and embrace of Ukraine. So what I would suggest is that the heads of state and government put out a political declaration like the one that was offered to the Western Balkans at Thessaloniki in 2003 that recognizes the European future of Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova, which basically means if the moment comes when they are ready to join, they will become members. Okay, and that's an if and a when. Which is significant because it gives a very clear message, and it also doesn't burn the conditions for membership, which are rightly there and need to be maintained. But that declaration would go a long way to making solidarity very real for Ukrainians. And at the same time, I would suggest an offer of full integration as far as possible of Ukraine into the European Green Deal as a kind of green membership of the EU. So what would that mean? Well, that would mean deepening many of the aspects of the current relationship, and you were asking Nicoletta about the future of neighbourhood policy and the relationship with the neighbours. And the Green Deal is actually a really important way of meeting Ukraine's immediate needs, as well as longer term decarbonisation of the economy and the climate, making Ukraine fully part of the climate transition, which would give a more sustainable and a more resilient economy for Ukraine. So it reduce the addiction to transit fees by giving alternative sources of income, would allow also Ukraine's energy intensive industries to decarbonise. So that steel, for example, and Ukrainian-made cement can enter the EU without a carbon border adjustment, so without any new kinds of tariffs. Already there's been, in the past weeks, a very important synchronization with the EU electricity grid. And Moldova did this as well, which allows then power to go to parts of Ukraine, even if there's a cutoff, as well as the now finally the achievement of the reverse flow of gas, which allows much better short-term security. And then long-term, there's the potential for offshore wind in Ukraine. There's also the potential for developing hydrogen in the country. There are all kinds of aspects of the EU's own energy independence plan that can be extended to Ukraine. So, and also the key thing, the most important thing that Ukraine would get from membership of the European Green Deal, well in advance of membership of the European Union, many, many years in advance of it, would be, of course, access to finance. Because Ukraine's own estimates of the financing needs for its climate transition are massively more than what's available at the moment under the existing EU instruments, many times more. So having there was always going to be a need for EU support to get there, now even more so, and to speed it up. And that would also offer a lot of hope, because Thomas was rightly pointing out the economic impact on the European economy, the devastation of the Ukrainian economy, and as Anna was just saying, even agriculture, food production is so much damaged that providing assistance for, we've got to think also about reconstruction needs, and providing them through the European Green Deal would be a way of offering both solidarity and practical help at the same time.
Thank you, Heather. I would like now to go back to Thomas. And Thomas, I take the opportunity also to forward to you some questions that we received, since you talk about the relationship between the European Union, neighborhood countries, but also strategic partners and competitors after this crisis. One question is if out of this crisis we will see any rapprochement between the European Union and Turkey, also on the basis of the efforts undertaken by Turkey to mediate a possible peace agreement between the parties. And if the European Union, second question, if the European Union has underestimated somehow the rapprochement between China and Russia as a consequence of this crisis. And finally, if this would lead to a strategically autonomous European Union, in particular concerning the US stance. So if you can give us, a picture of what we should expect about the international relations of the EU after the crisis.
Okay, thanks a lot. Let's try and be quick. Thanks, Nicoletta. But obviously, these are all huge issues, and inevitably, whatever I say will be rather simplistic. Maybe just before I answer those questions, two comments on what has been said so far. I mean, just to echo Heather's point. I mean, there is a lot of attention now, obviously, on this point of departure of a new era that happened with the Russian invasion, but that of course does not mean that existing problems have gone away. I mean, climate, Heather has emphasized that very instructively, remains a major challenge, and it's maybe even more difficult to address now under these circumstances. The same is true for refugees. We are now focusing on the Ukrainian border, but the Mediterranean refugee crisis is still there and is not going away either. And as far as the EU is concerned, while we maybe celebrate a moment of unity, we should not forget that the rule of law crisis we have inside the EU is not going away either. What Orban and Kaczynski have been doing to civil society, to the media, to the judiciary is not going away either. We may need them now in the current circumstances, but we still need to figure out a way of addressing these crises. So what Putin has been doing is to some extent pushing Europe a bit closer together in this moment, but at the same time also hiding to some extent the existing problems that remain, and it's going to be difficult to pay attention to them. When I speak of Orban, we can move directly to Turkey because the problem is there. I mean, to some extent, one has to become cynical now, and I don't want to spoil the party, but obviously it is a terrible situation in many ways. And part of the problem is that we now look at lesser evils, as it were. Clearly what Putin has done is so game-changing and so fundamentally evil that other evils pale in significance. We now have to perhaps accept certain behaviors by autocrats like Orban because we cannot risk the unity of the EU. And equally, we may have to accept Erdogan as an interlocutor. Obviously, they're having a meeting tomorrow in Antalya. But more broadly, Erdogan sees himself potentially as a deal maker between Russia and the West, which is odd, to be honest, for a NATO member. But nevertheless, some bitter pills will have to be swallowed, I believe, in order to maintain a strong coalition against Putin, and that is painful. That brings me to China. There, I would take a slightly different view from what is implied in the question, because I don't, like I said, like Sven Biskop and others, I don't buy into the mainstream view that China is on Russia's side. The Chinese are playing a long game. They always play a long game. They are clearly out there not to support one or the other side, but their own interest. And their own interest, and that's fundamentally different from Russia or Putin, is stability in the world. The Russian economy tends to benefit from instability because then the oil price goes up. I'm simplifying. But the Chinese economy needs stability. It's an export-oriented growth model, and they need Western markets, and they need they have interdependence with the West. To some extent, I think while clearly human rights are being violated in China, left, right, and center, and there are threats also to Taiwan and so on, but to some extent, we have also not made it easier for ourselves in being very bellicose towards China. And I think this is maybe a moment to reset somewhat the relationship between the West and China. Europe can play a critical role there because, unlike Washington, Brussels has already been quite nuanced, recognizing that there's systemic rivalry, but also strategic partnership. And so between Washington being quite extreme on China to some extent, Europe being a bit more moderate, and then the Chinese, I think there are different nuances in how one can relate to one another and then confront Putin. So I don't think China is lost yet, as it were, in terms of building also momentum against Russia. I mean, that might be very optimistic, but I think we should not. And finally, on US autonomy, that was a little strange. Maybe I misunderstood the question, but clearly, if anything, this is not a moment for Europe to look for autonomy. It's a moment for Europe to realize once again how dependent it is on the United States when it comes to military defense and the like. And while the EU might have been strengthened by this, also NATO has been strengthened by this. So I think, if anything, the transatlantic alliance is becoming more central rather than this discourse about strategic autonomy of Europe.
Thank you so much, Thomas. And Ferruccio, so you tackled the issue of the humanitarian emergency, and you also described how some of the EU member states that were traditionally very skeptical about a common EU response in helping and integrating asylum seekers, this time responded in an incredible positive way. And Poland is, of course, a case in point. On the other side, you warn against the possibility of having these first-class and second-class refugees for the future. So my question would be, what are the prospects for a structural change in the European Union in terms of the EU asylum policy? And this unity will stay for long, or do you think it is just an immediate reaction to the crisis?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I think it's very important to think of the gain of a strategic resilience on the side of the EU as a process, as a long process, as a process of transition that needs to go in parallel with other transitions. Heather said it very well. The green transition, there cannot be a strategic transition without a green transition, because strategic autonomy is about gaining, reducing dependence, is about reducing vulnerability. And energetic dependence is, of course, one. Vulnerability to unwanted migration is the other. One can speak about weaponization of refugees, this terrible term, only to the extent that on this side we perceive migrants and refugees as a threat, as a geopolitical threat. Yeah. Once you change this perception, with a cultural transition, you diffuse the weapon of refugees. They're not a weapon anymore. They're not a risk anymore. They are of course, an effort, a challenge, but maybe also an opportunity, as it will certainly happen with this massive Ukrainian inflow if, and I hope not, it will be stable, it will last long, because I hope there will soon be the conditions for them to return. Also because Ukraine is a demographically very weak nation, as we all are, more or less. So I think that there is a need for matching the geopolitical transition, not only with a green transition, but with a cultural transition. In the way we consider migration, moving closer to the way it is perceived in other continents, in other rich countries, which are of course not immune from xenophobia either, but maybe they have a fundamentally different still perception. Of course, in this transition process, there will be, it will take long, there will be several steps. The Mediterranean will remain for long a place where the energetic dependence and vulnerability to unwanted migration will persist. Because, for instance, when we go to the Emirates or to Algeria to negotiate more energetic supply, we are negotiating with regimes that are not, necessarily always rational, reliable, and transparent. We are negotiating with places that are also potentially generating large-scale forced migration movements, as is the case with Algeria. Hopefully not, but we never know. And of course, Libya is still there as a massive stumbling block. But the war in Yemen, of course, also something we tend to forget all the time, but it's there. And some stumbling blocks are being eroded, and luckily, I mean, a few years ago, we talked a lot about the Visegrad 4, Visegrad group, which is both for internal political reasons in at least Slovakia and the Czech Republic, but also for these broader international geopolitical reasons, is melting down, apparently. And this, I think, is generating some more opportunities. But of course, it will be for decades probably a game of lesser evils. What Thomas was saying, we see it everywhere. We see it also with the reopening of negotiations between the US and Venezuela. Some new pragmatism is happening there. But yes, I would like to close on this note that this cultural transition towards a more open culture is also essential to building a European strength and European sovereignty, because European sovereignty cannot be built on fear of innocent and disarmed people, as it was the case until recently, and it is still the case when we look at other parts of the world than Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Ferruccio. I would like to go back to Anna. We have a few minutes left. One of the questions that were addressed by the public is if the European Union is the most appropriate actor to negotiate a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. And also, allow me to add another question. How do you see, from a scholar point of view, the future relationship between Ukraine and the European Union? Thanks, Anna.
Well, it's actually a bit hard to remain a scholar in this situation, but I will try. And probably the answer to this question goes together with the first one, because I think, and I hear like from the other side of the fence, let's say, agree with Heather that the clear European perspective would be a very strong message for this in this situation that is in the war that is going now, and in the any possible peace negotiations, because we of course quite realistic that even if it's given, let's say, tomorrow, it won't come into reality for probably another decade, because there is too many things to be done and to be negotiated when after the end of the war and of the conflict, because there is a lot of questions that needs to be resolved for that. But a clear perspective is very European perspective is very important, because it's not only rise the spirit, it also a clear sign for the other side, let's say for Russia here, and I think it is important. As for negotiations, everyone here is a bit skeptical about whether Russia in the current situation is actually ready and are really up for negotiations of ceasefire, because the demands that they put forward are clearly they won't be supported by everyone in Ukraine, because they actually directly threaten the existence of Ukraine. So we do not really see any readiness for the negotiations on Russia's side. And although our Minister of Foreign Affairs Dmytro Kuleba goes tomorrow to Lavrov, he did say that he wonders if there will be a real talk tomorrow, and not just reiterating of the statements Lavrov and his ministry were doing all this time about denazification or whatever they were calling they are doing in Ukraine. So I do think that European Union could be a negotiator, but the problem I see here is that, in my mind, Putin and Russia clearly see European Union as one of the sides of the conflict here, and that is probably the reason why they won't agree for anyone from European Union as a negotiator. Although, of course, for Ukraine it will be a win situation if there will be a negotiator, if European Union would be a negotiator here. That is in answer to your question.
Yes, Anna, thank you so much. That was very clear, and I thank you for your intervention in this meeting. And also, I would like to reiterate also on behalf of the Institute our closeness and support to you, to your institution, and to the Ukrainian people. Thank you so much. And I also thank very much the speakers, Heather Grabbe, Ferruccio Pastore, and Thomas Christiansen for this discussion today, and also the more than 100 participants online. And as an institute, we will continue to reflect on the different aspects of the crisis, and in particular on the prospects for European differentiation and integration next week. So you will find all the information about our next event on our website. Thank you so much, and see you soon. Bye.